I'm happy to introduce Ann Loparo, pastry chef and owner of Annie's Signature Sweets in Cleveland, Ohio. In the spirit of St. Patrick's Day, Ann will be demonstrating how to make Irish cream cheesecake. We love for these cooking programs to be interactive, so if you have any questions for Ann during the program, please send them in using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and I will relay the questions along to her. Also, if you're looking for the recipe, it was included with the Zoom link in the email you got, and I will send it out again after the program. So if Ann's ready, we'll go ahead and get started.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Happy St. Patrick's Day. I've got my little green on. I got my little shamrock. So thank you guys for joining me. I'm excited to be here and teach you guys how to make this cheesecake. So today we're actually going to make it in a muffin pan. This will allow your cheesecakes to be easy to be picked up. You can make them, so you don't have to cut a whole cheesecake, so they're a little bit more versatile. But you can do this recipe in a cheesecake pan or a cake pan as well. But today, for versatility, we're going to do them in a cheesecake, in a muffin pan. So we will start with the crust. So you can use whatever flavor crust that you would like. For the Irish cream, I chose a chocolate crust. So I just took some sandwich cookies. You can get any kind that you like, and just pulse them in like a food processor. Anything like that, you can get them chopped up. Sometimes you could buy stuff that's already in crumbs, but for purposes of today, I've already got mine crumbed. And then we're just gonna have some melted butter. I always bake with unsalted butter. That's just what I prefer. You can use salted butter. You just wanna make sure if you're adding a salted butter that you don't add too much extra salt to your recipe. So all that I'm gonna do is take my melted butter and my cookie crumbs, and I'm gonna mix them up together with my hand or a spoon. I'll use the spatula. And then I also have my muffin liners, which, these are like cupcake liners to most people. So let's line those first. And then we can mix up our crust. And then we're gonna pre-bake our crust just for about 8 to 10 minutes. And then when we're doing that, we can get set up with the cheesecake batter. So again, you can use another flavor crust if you wanted to make it a little bit different. You can use graham crackers, you can use something with cinnamon, anything that would complement whatever kind of cheesecake you're making. So today we're gonna use the chocolate. So I have my 12 pan liners in. And then the other ingredients that we're going to use when we make the cheesecake are our cream cheese, our sugar, and then our eggs, 2 whole eggs, our vanilla, and our Irish cream. So today I'm going to use Bailey's. That's my preferred favorite one. So I have it in with my eggs, so it's easy to mix. And then later we will make a ganache, which is like a fudge topping. And that we will be using heavy cream, more butter, and then chocolate chips. So I'll go through every step so you know what I'm doing. And then we will get started. So I've got my cookie crumbs, I've got my butter. So what you're looking for is you always start with your butter and you melt it. You're looking for like a wet sand consistency, but you don't want it soaked. So I tend to have an amount of butter that I measure, but sometimes I don't add it all. It kind of just depends on what it is absorbing in the cookies. So some cookies might absorb a little bit more and some a little bit less. So you want to have your butter melted, and before you dump it all in, just slowly dump it in and then kind of stir it together until you can pack it in your hand and it looks kind of like wet sand, but not soaked. Otherwise, you just have leaky butter and that's not going to be as good. So I'm going to start with that. And I'm just going to stir it together in my bowl. So I'm going to leave about maybe 1/4 cup of the butter out just to kind of stir it up first. And if you don't mind kind of digging your hands in, you can just dig your hands in. That's kind of how I check it.
We've got one question here in reference to the ingredients.
Yep.
Someone would like to know, is heavy cream also called heavy whipping cream? Is that the same thing?
Yes, it is the same thing. There are percentage differences, but I interchangeably use them. So for this recipe, it doesn't make a difference. Very good question. Thank you. Yeah, and I could show you what I use too if you need me to. I can get that out. I have some in my fridge. So when I get set up for my baking, whether I'm teaching or whether I'm just baking for fun, because I still do that, I set myself up with all my ingredients in front of me. It kind of makes for things to go a little bit more efficiently, and hopefully less often there's going to be a mistake so you don't forget something. So I have little bowls with all my stuff. Okay, so got my chocolate cookie crumb, and I just want to pack it. So I can feel it's a tiny bit sticky, but it's not soaked. Like, it's coming off my hands a little bit, but I want it to be able to pack into the cheesecake pan or the muffin liners today. So depending on what you have at home or wherever you're baking, I use cookie scoops a lot for my baking. I know not everybody has access to these at home. So a regular spoon will work. Or if you wanted to use like a little measuring spoon, a couple tablespoons, that's how I put mine into my muffin cups. So if you're using a tablespoon measurement, you could probably use 1 to 2 tablespoons per cup. I tend to only put my crust in the bottom of my shell. I don't want it all the way in the muffin liner on the sides, but you can absolutely do that if you really like a lot of crust. I tend to just put it in the middle, and then once I scoop them all into the pan, I press them down. So one of the things I learned being a chef for almost 15 years is to kind of be a little more systematic with things. So I do each step, and then I move on to the next thing. So I'm going for putting the 1 spoonful in each liner, and then when I press it down, if I feel like I need a little bit more, then I can add a little bit more.
We have a question.
Yep.
Hey, Anne says, if using a springform pan, I put foil around my springform pan and place on a cookie sheet with water. Do you do this as well?
I do. I don't do that with the muffin pan. You can. I mean, you don't need to put foil around it because it's already sealed, having its own little slot. For the springform pan, I do, because you want to have some moisture in there so you don't overcook your cheesecake. It is a custard, so a lot of people feel like it's a cake. It's shaped like a cake, but it is more like a custard or a pudding. So I do, when I'm doing a full cheesecake, put a little bit of water onto my pan, my baking pan, and the foil just kind of helps make sure you don't get any leakage from the pan. The springform pans are pretty secure, but occasionally it might be a little bit out of alignment, and then you just don't want to have a soggy bottom. So very good question. Thank you for your question. Okay. So again, I'm going to just put a few scoops into each one while I put 1 spoonful in, and I'm going to start pressing these down and see how much is in there and if I want to add a little bit more. And again, I personally only like this to be about 1/4 full, but feel free to add more if you'd like. If it feels a little drier when you're putting it in, go ahead and add a little more of your melted butter. And pre-baking it just kind of helps ensure, that your crust is cooked and you have enough butter in there so you don't overdo it. So you don't always have to pre-bake your crust, but that's just a habit I've gotten into, that I don't have to think twice about it. And I know it's going to set up and that there's enough in there. So I am going to add a little bit more to all these just because it's a little bit less than I thought.
We have a couple ingredient questions again.
Yep.
One question is, what could you substitute for the liquor?
Good question. So if you didn't want to use liquor in this recipe, you don't even have to substitute it. You can use vanilla and just use it as that. If you wanted to make it an extract of any flavor of your choice, you can sub that out, or again, it could be a plain cheesecake. I personally use a lot of almond extract, and I use some peppermint around the holidays. I don't use it too often. And then, other alcohols, if you're looking for some other kind of alcohol infused cheesecake. You can use rum, you can use whiskey. Depends on what you're going for.
Okay, and then Diane would like to know, if you use a springform pan, how long do you pre-bake the crust?
I guess, oddly enough, now that I'm thinking about it, I don't tend to change the amount of time on my pre-bake, even if I'm using less crust. So I would still say about 10 minutes. But even when I do them with less crust, I would say the least amount I do is about 7 minutes. So, because it's still going to cook when you put your batter in. But yeah, I would say anywhere from 7 to 10 minutes. If I was doing an 8-inch or 9-inch springform pan, I would still do 10 minutes. Even though that doesn't sound like it should work, it does. Okay, so let me show you what this looks like. So I know they don't look like they're completely full, and they're not, but I will take one out and show you. It's just kind of on the side. So mine, again, are not super full. No matter how full you fill yours, I'd still put them in at 350 for about 8 to 10 minutes. And I'm going to do that real quick, and then I'm going to wash my hands because I got chocolate on them. All right. Okay, so now the recipe does call for quite a bit of crust, and if you don't want it that much crust, I mean, I do have quite a bit left, but I'm not using a ton of it today either. If you have extra crust, you can save it, and it will be fine. You can put it in your fridge or your freezer. It's just butter and cookies. But if you feel like this is way too much crust and you only wanted a little bit or no crust, you don't have to put crust, then you can reduce it. Just kind of use the same method with the butter. Just kind of slowly add it and then pack it. So in the recipe, I believe it says 2 cups. If you think you just want to do 1 cup, you can always add more. But if you feel like this is way too much, because I have probably about a cup or so left, but I use it for a lot of things. So
you scrape the filling out of the cookies before you?
Good question. I do not. I like it in there. And I know some of the places that I've worked, we used to add sugar to the chocolate cookies and the butter. I don't. I mean, I like sweets, and I would probably still add sugar, but I just didn't feel that was necessary. So yeah, no, I don't scrape them. I just literally take the sandwich cookies that you get at the store. I just throw them in a little food processor, and you can't even tell that the cream's in there. So, I mean, you don't need to worry about that at all. Good questions. You guys have great questions. Okay, so that's baking. So next, I'll show you kind of how I've set up. I have my cream cheese, my 2 blocks of cream cheese, and my sugar in my bowl. This is my Pampered Chef bowl that is 20 years old, older than my career. And then I just like to start with the sugar and the cream cheese. So cream cheese is usually best at room temperature. I know I get that question a lot about what is room temperature, because, is it an hour? Is it 5 hours? Is it overnight? Typically, I would say at least an hour before you're baking with it, it's best to pull it out of the fridge. And I even open the packet and just set on the counter. You want it a little bit softer so it doesn't break your hand mixer if you have a hand mixer, or if you're going to end up beating it a little bit longer if it's too cold. So typically with butter and also with cream cheese, I'll cut it into smaller pieces. Cream cheese is a little harder to cut because it's super soft than butter. But, that's kind of what I did here. I kind of broke it up into some smaller pieces. Mine's been out for about an hour and 10-ish minutes. So it's not super soft, but what we're going to do is when we whip it up, it will soften. And when you make a cheesecake, you want to make sure that you are not beating it too much. So I beat it as much as I can until it's soft with just the cream cheese and the sugar. If you add the eggs and you keep it on high for too long, you're adding a lot more air to it, which is what happens when a lot of times you get the souffle where it puffs up and then it sinks and then you get all these cracks in it. So you want to make sure your cream cheese is pretty close to room temperature. Again, if it's not been out for an hour, just make sure that when you're creaming your cream cheese and your sugar, that it's mixed well enough before you add your eggs. So the eggs will make it look kind of like it's curdled, and you're going to mix it just for a little bit. But you want it to be creamy, and you don't want to have any lumps of cream cheese. So the most mixing should be done with just the sugar and the cream cheese.
Someone would like to know, if you use Splenda instead of sugar, would it make the consistency be off?
Good question. It's been a long time since I've used Splenda, like 14 years. So I know I used it in certain recipes, but I don't know for sure. It's been a really long time since I've used it. I know that the consistency is a little different, but I guess it would just be as if you were not having any sugar in your cream cheese, because it's so light. So I don't think it wouldn't ruin it, but I don't know if it would sweeten it the way that sugar does. So I don't know that answer for sure. So I'm sorry, I can't answer that 100%, but I know it won't ruin your cheesecake. I just know that it was lighter, and when we used it for heavy cream and that kind of stuff, the consistency was just a little bit off. But I know it's not grainy. I know it's not super grainy like some of the sugars, the alternative sugars, but I'm not 100% sure on that. Okay, so my crust has about 4 more minutes, and then I'll just kind of talk through the difference between using a hand mixer and a stand mixer. Today I'll just use a hand mixer. It's just easier because I'm here at my table. If you guys were using a stand mixer, you would want to start with this attachment, which is the paddle attachment. I wouldn't want to use the whip attachment just because it's going to get more air into your cheesecake, and it's probably going to souffle it again. Another thing that could cause your cheesecake to souffle is if it's overheated. So I tend to either keep it at 350 or I turn it down to 325 when I pop the cheesecakes in. So I just do the crust at 350. And then if I'm doing a full cheesecake and I want to put the water in it, I sometimes do leave it at 350. If you're ever not sure, 325 will just take a few extra minutes for something like this. I would always recommend going a little bit less until you know how your oven is going to cook it, because you don't want to overdo it. So a lot of times I'll tell my students in my classes that if they have a convection oven, that's fine. You don't need to have a convection oven for baking. I know some people think it's better, and it is for certain things. But in my home, I don't have a convection oven. And in my kitchen where I'm normally teaching, I do have a convection oven. So there are definitely variations to them, and there are benefits to certain recipes. Cheesecake, you want it at a lower temperature. So I wouldn't necessarily cook a cheesecake at a convection oven temperature any higher than, I usually actually go 25 degrees less than what the recipe calls for. So if you only have a convection oven, or you choose to only bake with convection, that's totally fine. I would just suggest going 25 degrees less on whatever the recipes are that you're doing. It just tends to circulate more heat in there. And if you have certain hot spots, it could cause, some little bit of challenges with some of your cheesecakes or anything else that you're making. So my crusts are almost done, so let me grab those, and then I will start mixing the batter in a second. All right. All right, so I know you can't really see how much this really has changed, but it's set. So it definitely, when I touch it, it's going to be a little bit soft. But I'm just going to leave these set aside for a few minutes while I get my batter ready.
Someone is wondering, what quantity of extract would you use if you're replacing the Baileys?
Good question. So extracts are more potent. So I believe on the recipe, I don't have it in front of me, I believe I put a tablespoon of the Baileys or Irish cream. So I would use about a teaspoon of an extract just because they're a little more strong. So I would say about a teaspoon. If you feel like you want to go a little heavier, maybe about a teaspoon and a half. But a tablespoon might be too much, depending on what you're really looking for. Vanilla, you can go wrong with vanilla, but typically vanilla is not going to make a huge difference. But if you were to overdo almond or peppermint, it might taste like really bad. So You can overdo vanilla, but I haven't had an issue with that. Even some of the jobs I had, someone accidentally added 10 ounces instead of 1 ounce of vanilla to a recipe.
Oh, no.
I was like, oh no. And it didn't ruin anything. So that was a huge difference, but thankfully it worked out. So yeah, so I think if you did a tablespoon on accident, it wouldn't hurt it.
And then I think you kind of mentioned this in the beginning, but someone is asking, could you use Nabisco famous chocolate wafers for the crust? I think you mentioned you could use like kind of whatever cookie you want.
Yeah, so I'm not sponsoring any kind of product, but I use, the chocolate sandwich cookies at any store really. But I've used graham cracker, the little Honey Maid, I think has the little graham cracker bears and stuff like that. I've used vanilla wafers. I've used anything. And I think a lot of those come in chocolate now too. So yeah, and I know some of them, if you're not using the chocolate, do have like boxes of graham cracker crumbs, that kind of stuff. But I've used ginger snaps. I've used anything. So the crust, like I said, your liquid might vary slightly because some might absorb a little differently. That's why I always vary. I usually overcompensate the butter a little bit than to have not enough. Then you're just not going to have enough and you're going to be like having to keep going back. So I don't want you to have to keep going back to things too often because I know that gets stressful. People don't like to do that with baking. They already think it's stressful enough. So, but yeah. So yeah, with the baking, the cheesecake part, it only takes in the muffin pan about 20 minutes to make the batter. If they bake like cupcakes. So I'm going to get that started so I have time to show you what they look like when we're done. But again, I'm going to use a hand mixer today. So I just use the regular beaters that come on it. But if I was using my stand mixer today, I would use the paddle attachment. So this just helps soften the butter a little bit better. I mean, not butter, the cream cheese. And then again, I'm just going to do the cream cheese and the sugar to start. Once that looks creamy enough to me, I don't want it liquidy, but I do want it pretty well combined. I'm going to slowly add in my eggs, which are 2 whole eggs. I always use large. I've bought medium on accident before and it's worked. I just usually add one extra one if I have done that. And then again, if you want to add vanilla and the Irish cream, you could do both. So that won't hurt it. If you want to add your tablespoon of Irish cream and a teaspoon of vanilla, that's fine. And I don't remember if I put salt on the recipe. Sometimes I forget to mention salt. I am baking with unsalted butter. So if you want to throw in a teaspoon of salt, if you wanted to do that, you could do that as well. So I am not adding salt to mine. I just know that I don't need it for this. But again, if you want to use salt, just don't overdo it. And especially if you're using a salted butter, maybe use half a teaspoon if you're using a salted butter. So either will work. So let me get this mixing here and I'll show you how this goes. All right, so break on me now. So you want to stop in between and just kind of scrape scrape the sides, make sure that it's pretty smooth. I'll show you what mine looks like in a second. So if you've ever seen like a whipped cream cheese, that's basically what this looks like. It's smooth, it's pretty soft. Move this light over here. So this doesn't have the eggs in it yet. I'm going to add them next, but I don't see any hunks of cream cheese. It's pretty soft. So it will soften a little bit more when I add the eggs and when I add the extract and the Baileys. So I know that I'm good to keep mixing it and just add those in. So another thing, I always make sure that I am cracking my eggs into a separate container. One, for the ease of mixing, but two, to make sure I don't get any shells in there. So I know a lot of people are in the habit of just kind of going into their bowl. You just want to make sure you don't have any eggshells. So that would be the next thing. So you can add one at a time. Sometimes if you have a lot of eggs, they kind of slide in, even if you try to do one when you crack it into a separate bowl. So I'm going to add one egg, mix it. If they both fall in, don't worry, it'll still work. Just kind of give it some time. So I'm going to put one in. Just start that one. And again, it will look a little curdly as I mix it, but you just want to make sure it's not on high speed at this point. Low to medium speed, just to get it incorporated. And then I'm going to add the second egg. If you're adding salt and you didn't add it yet, you can add it at this point. Again, just about a teaspoon if you want to add any salt. Okay, so I know that was like a few seconds, but you kind of just want to look at your batter. It will start to have kind of a yellowy color to it because you've added the eggs, but it's getting a little bit softer from that one egg and that little bit of flavoring. So I don't want to overmix this, so I'm going to add my second egg, and this has the rest of my Baileys and my vanilla in it, so that will also help kind of thin it out a little bit. Again, we don't want it runny, but we do want it, you know, a little bit on the thicker side. So it's not too liquidy. You're not going to have a cheesecake. You're going to have something else. Okay, so my mixer is probably about 275 watts. I know there are some hand mixers that are a lot less than that, so yours may take quite a bit longer. But again, I know what my consistency is that I'm looking for, so I'll show you what this looks like.
Someone mentioned that the recipe called for 1/4 of a cup of Irish cream, but she thought you mentioned 1 tablespoon.
Oh, okay, yeah, no, that's correct. Sorry. Trying to do this from memory. I didn't print that up. You're fine. That's correct. Yep.
Okay. And then I think you mentioned this, but they might have missed. Can you say again what happens if you overmix?
Yes. So overmixing will allow it to possibly souffle and then shrink again, or settle, I should say, not shrink, and then crack, which is not very appetizing looking, but it will also could potentially, you know, curdle your mix if you do that. So I know that there's a fine line between overmixing and undermixing, and everyone tends to be afraid to overmix, but some people undermix. So there is a slight variation. I would just say cream it for about 3 to 4 minutes in the beginning with just the cream cheese and the sugar, and then add 1 egg, and then cream it for about another 30 seconds to a minute, another egg, 30 seconds to a minute, and then maybe 1 more minute. Don't keep going, because a lot of people will kind of keep it on the mixer and get their other stuff going, or just kind of forget that it's been on for that long. So the whole mixing process, again, depending on how soft your cream cheese was, the heaviness of your mixer or the speed of it, it could take you one day 5 minutes, another day it might take you 10. Just kind of keep an eye on what to look for. Look for it to be smooth. Look for there to be no lumps. Again, when you add your eggs, it could curdle it. And you don't want it to overcook your cheesecake because then it won't be as good. So.
They're not sure what you mean by it will souffle.
Okay, so souffle, like it will rise up in the oven. So when these bake in the muffin pan, they will look like a cupcake. And as they cool, they will flatten a little bit. So the souffle is like if you've ever seen a cracked cheesecake, you will see it kind of dome up a little bit when it comes out of the oven and then settle. And usually the cracks are the best indicator, honestly. So a souffle typically is egg whites folded into some other kind of base, cheese or chocolate or something like that. Those only last souffled for a couple seconds, then they just fall. So maybe that's a better word with the falling. I don't know if that explained it, but hopefully that helps. Okay, so now I'm gonna go back to my crusts. And I'm gonna use my cookie scoop just out of ease. I'm only gonna fill these about 3/4 of the way full. So every muffin pan is not created equal. So you're just gonna fill it about 3/4 of the way full. So you have a little bit of room to add that ganache that we're gonna make. If you have a little bit more than that when you start out, it's okay, just kind of, it'll settle a little bit. You can always just take it out a little bit. Go to the next one. So depending on your muffin pans, they are standard sizes, but I do have several different muffin pans that are not exactly the same size. So you may get 12 of these, you may get 16 of these. Kind of just depends. And it also depends on how full you fill your crust.
I have a feeling this question is a little bit ahead of us, but in the recipe it calls for sifted cocoa powder. Is that in the mix or is that for garnishing?
That's if you wanted to make like a chocolate. It kind of depends on if that's what you're going for. You can add cocoa powder because it actually does enhance the flavor of the Irish cream, but that's optional. So okay. Yeah, and you want to make sure it's sifted because you want to make sure there's no lumps of it. So I would sift it and add it in right before I start scooping it if I was doing it that way. Yep, that's optional. If you wanted a chocolate Irish cream, if you want to keep it just Irish cream, because we're making the chocolate ganache for on top, you can do that as well. And then you could also fold in or mix in by hand chocolate chips or something like that if you wanted to. So I'm going to put this in the oven and set a timer for about 20 minutes. So now while that's baking, if you have extra batter, you can keep that too. I only did my crust with a little bit of it. So I have a little bit extra batter, but I can finish those later. How are we doing with questions? Any other questions right now?
Good. Can you just turn your camera down just a little bit to see the table a little bit more?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay. So the last thing we're going to make is going to be the ganache, which is a fudge. So heavy cream and butter. Again, heavy whipping cream or heavy cream are about the same thing, especially with this recipe specifically. And then chocolate chips. So you can use semi-sweet, you can use mini chips, you can use regular chips. I always like the darker chocolate, but at least a semi-sweet for this specific recipe. So the heavy cream and the butter are equal parts. Actually, they're not. The heavy cream and the chocolate are equal parts. And so typically ganache are equal parts cream and chocolate. I've always added a little bit of butter. It gives it a little richer flavor and it gives it a little shine. So I'm using 6 ounces, which is 1 cup of chocolate chips, 6 ounces, which is 3/4 of a cup of heavy cream, and then 2 ounces of butter, which is typically half a stick. I've learned with all my baking classes, especially virtually, when people have to get their own ingredients, that not all sticks are created equal. So you want to make sure that your stick is a 4-ounce stick before you do a half a stick. I guess there are some sticks that are a little bit more and a little bit less. So you just want to keep an eye on that. So what I'm going to do is take my heavy cream and my butter and put them in my microwave. If you don't have a microwave, you can use a small pot. And then I just have this heat-proof glass container that I'm going to put my chocolate chips in. You don't need a container like this. You can put it in a bowl. But for purposes of you guys seeing what it looks like, I'm going to use a glass Pyrex container here. So I'm going to just heat this up in the microwave until it starts to steam. All the butter might not completely melt, but I definitely want the cream steamed. And I also have cut my butter into little cubes. Once this gets steamy and hot, but not over boiling, and you will know what that looks like. Hopefully that doesn't happen to you. Don't put it on like 5 minutes and walk away. I'd say set your microwave for about 1.5 minutes and then do 30-second increments. Once it's steamy, just under a boil, I'm going to pour it over my chocolate chips. And then I'm going to just let it sit for a few seconds. And then I'm going to stir it together. So let me do that. And I just have like a spoon to stir it with. You can use a whisk, you can use another spatula. So I sometimes stop my microwave and just kind of swirl the cream and the butter and see if it needs any more time. Again, every microwave has a different power level, so yours might take a lot less time. That's why I'd say start at about 1.5 minutes and then add 30 seconds as needed. Usually it takes about 2 to 2.5 minutes. The kitchen where I was teaching in-person classes, it's a convection type of powerful microwave, so it heats things way too fast. So definitely always start at a lower temperature or a lower amount of time. Okay, so I'll show you what this looks like. It's just kind of steamy. When I stir it, I could see the steam coming out, but my butters, there's still a couple little chunks of butter, and that's okay. So I'm going to pour this over my chocolate chips. And I want it to be in a container that it will cover all of the chocolate chips pretty evenly. So you could see the chips in there, but what's happening is it's soaking in all that chocolate. And I want to make sure that it gets soaked in before I stir it so I don't have any lumps of chocolate in there. I want it pretty smooth. So I will show you what this will look like once it sets up. This was some I had the other day. It's going to be like a fudge consistency. So it will be like a spoonable fudge that you can use later for piping. But once we make it initially, it will be like a hot chocolate looking consistency. So one of the things I do on occasion, if I need it in a little bit, but I don't need it right away, I'll take a pan. It could be a sheet pan. It could be anything with sides. I recommend something with sides so you don't have to worry about moving it while it's hot and dripping it. I'll take it after I've stirred it and just spread it in a pan and put it in my fridge for a little bit so it'll be easier to work with. And then once your cheesecakes have set up, the cheesecakes take about an hour or so before you want to cover them in the ganache. So it's something that will set up while your cheesecakes are chilling. And then if it gets really, it doesn't get that hard but within an hour, but if it gets a little bit too hard, you can just microwave it again, small increments. This time I wouldn't go a minute and a half. I would just go about 30 seconds, stir it a little bit, and then it'll work like a fudge topping, which is always really good. And I did put my Baileys in with my cream. So it's kind of soaking in here. I'm just going to stir it up. You can use a whisk. Smells really good. Again, this is optional. You don't have to use this ganache if you want to just have a standard cheesecake. I just thought it'd be another kind of fun way to add more Irish cream to our Irish cream cheesecake. And more chocolate, because chocolate and Irish cream go really well together. So it will look kind of separated at first, and you just want to keep stirring it. And again, it will thicken as it cools.
We have someone wondering if you could put the ganache on like 2 hours before serving, or do you want to do it right before you serve it?
Very good question. You do want it to set up in the fridge for a little bit. So I would recommend probably at least 30 minutes before, but an hour to 2 hours is a better idea. Or like the night before, if you're creating the cheesecakes like today and you want to just in the morning top them and put them in the fridge, so don't have to think about it later, that works too. So it depends kind of what you're looking for. If you want to make it less challenging for you, I've also stuck them in the freezer, but I do that after they've been out at room temperature for a little bit. So typically I leave them out at room temperature for about 15 minutes. And then if I need them within an hour or so, I'll stick them in the freezer for about another 40 minutes or so. And they will be set, but they're just going to be a little bit softer when you handle them. When I teach this class virtually, typically people, will eat them about an hour later, but I tell them they're cooked once they're out of the oven. So if you don't care eating it soft, then you can eat it right out of the oven. I know a lot of people don't like to wait for their baked goods too long once you've put in all that work, but they are better when they're a little bit chilled. So they can set up and they can be handled a little bit better. Because these are in a muffin pan, they will cool a lot quicker. If you were doing them in an 8 or 9 inch cheesecake pan or a pie tin or something, it would take a little bit longer. But here we go. This is the consistency that we have. This is a really good recipe to have. It's like a fudge filling. It also, like I said, melts really well, remelts. So if you wanted to put this on ice cream or eat it with a spoon, no judgment. I like to eat it with a spoon a lot of times. But it does kind of work on any kind of thing. You could do it on cupcakes. You could do it on your cheesecake. Put it in a pie tin with a pie crust. It's really good. Let's see, we got about 10 minutes left in there. So I'll tell you a little bit about my business while we're waiting for a few minutes. I've been a pastry chef for about 15 years, and I started this is my second career. I was a social worker out of college, so I did that for 6 years. I'm originally from Cleveland, which is where I am now. And I went to pastry school at 29 and started over. So pastry has been my go-to. It's been my passion. It's always what I'm doing, whether I'm looking for something fun to do or just a stress release. It's been fun for me. But I never anticipated being an entrepreneur or a pastry chef. But it was always what I would go to when I was needing like I said, either something fun or just something stressful, or I only eat sweets, so to satisfy all my sweets cravings. But I started my business 3.5 years ago after I was in the restaurants for 10 years. I took a year kind of to figure out what I was going to do after that. But I worked in places in Florida, Georgia, North Carolina. I worked at Nabisco in Pennsylvania. And I worked at the Cleveland Museum of Art. I worked at Lola. I worked for a catering company. So I've kind of been a little bit of everywhere, but I've always gravitated towards mini desserts. So I started out just doing catering sales when I started this business. And I have a lemon lavender shortbread, which I actually do have behind me today. I don't always have it on me. But I have a lemon lavender shortbread, which was the first dessert that I made as a business owner. And I started this business in August of 2017. So when I started it, I knew I just wanted to do as fresh as possible desserts. And in the restaurants, I knew that a lot of the stuff was not fresh. A lot of it was frozen. And I didn't want to keep doing that. So I wanted to make everything as possible, fresh as possible. So I started out doing that. And then about 6 months into my business, the space I found to do my desserts for catering orders and stuff, a licensed kitchen, is about 15 minutes from where I live. Is a big space. So there's 3 giant tables. It's a 100-year-old building. And the owner had suggested I started teaching. So I started teaching in there. February 5th of 2018 was my first class. I taught 32 classes in 2018. I taught 100 classes in 2019. And then in 2020, I had already taught about 35 or 40 classes, and then the whole world shut down. So I had to think quick. I'm single. I had to figure out a way to make a living, and I didn't know if I wanted to focus on the teaching or the desserts. But teaching has been, so fun for me, and I've been able to meet people from everywhere, and it's been a lot of fun. So I went virtual, and about 2 weeks later, I was featured in Country Living magazine. I was featured in Parade magazine in August, and they named me as like the top cooking classes in the country. So that was pretty cool. So I've now taught almost 350 classes in 3 years, and that includes the pandemic classes as well. But I almost doubled my classes last year. I've taught in Germany, Canada, the Philippines, the UK, so it's been a lot of fun. And then I do have a lot of people in Ohio, thankfully still, but I've taught kids camps, corporate events, library events, a couple different things. And all my classes are interactive, so I want everybody to, I know this is a demo style more today, but all of my classes that I normally teach are very interactive. My most popular class is French macarons. Everybody probably knows what those are, and if you don't, that's fine, but they're the little sandwich cookies that are different colors with the frosting in them. I've taught that almost 100 of the 350 classes, about 100 times, literally. So that's definitely most popular. I do have some gluten-free options. I know that that's tricky in person to do because the kitchen I'm at is not technically gluten-free, but when people do these at home, they have the opportunity to make it as gluten-free as they can in their own home. But I teach yeast breads, I teach cakes, I teach cookies, I teach cheesecakes. Right now I have over 30 topics on my website. And I also have like a baking toolkit and my aprons for sale on there. But yeah, so if you guys are interested in taking classes with me or know anybody that would be interested, you can find me at anniesignature.com, and I'd love to have you guys. So I think I got a couple minutes on my cheesecake. Do we have any other questions while we're waiting?
We do have a couple questions, but I just wanted to mention that after the program, I will send an email out to everyone, and I'll put Annie's website in there so you can check out the cooking classes. I've been on there to look at some of the topics, and they look so good. So be sure to check it out. It's a fun thing to do while we're still doing virtual from home things.
Thank you.
And we do have a couple questions here while we wait for the cheesecake to be done.
Yep.
First is, can the cheesecake be frozen, thawed, and then served?
Yes, yes, and yes. Yes. You can freeze them. I would recommend, still letting them cool to room temperature before you pop them in the freezer so they're not melting anything in your freezer. So again, like if you're doing the muffin size, Cheesecakes like I just did, those don't take that long to cool, you know, and they won't be completely cool, but I would say at least 15 minutes at room temperature. If I'm doing a normal cheesecake for an order, I usually do twice this recipe. So that I typically wait maybe 45 minutes or so before I put it in the fridge. That could also cause some potential, like you don't want it to go from a drastic temperature to another drastic temperature. So you always want to cool it for a little bit. But yeah, these can freeze. I put them in the freezer, and then after they're frozen, I'll put them in a Ziploc bag and just make sure it's sealed and airtight and not like having all the air in there so it doesn't get freezer burn. They will freeze for a good 2 to 3 months if they can last that long, because I know people think they'll freeze things for that long, and then they tell me later, they're like, that lasted like 3 days. No, if you want to freeze them, they're absolutely freezable. And then, yeah, you can just put them in the fridge, or they freeze, they thaw, can't use my words tonight, they thaw pretty well at room temperature for like 15 minutes. I've actually eaten them frozen too. They're not bad frozen. Don't hurt.
And then someone was wondering if you have ideas for plating the cheesecake with decorative sides.
Yeah. If you guys have, I have some fresh berries here, just in a bowl, but in the restaurants, we always did composed plates. So I don't have any sauces made, or I would totally show you some caramel and all that. I actually just got rid of my caramel because it had been in my fridge for too long. Yeah, if you have either a homemade caramel, or I mean, this could be a sauce if you wanted to kind of drizzle some sauce on a plate and put some fresh berries. You can put some fresh mint leaves. I know you could get those at the grocery store. If you wanted to make it more chocolate, if you wanted to add more chocolate, I have some chocolate covered espresso beans that would be kind of fun. I like a clean, classic look. I don't like to overdo things. So something for me with chocolate, I tend to put berries because they pop, and they also give it a little bit of another level of texture and flavor. But I know not everybody likes berries and chocolate. I don't know why, but a lot of people don't, I've been told. So I tend to use, even on my brownies, I'll put like raspberries because I like the color of it. So that's always pretty for presentation, as long as you like those flavors together. You can always do whipped cream. If you don't want to whip up cream, you can use like a Greek yogurt. But I know that's a lot of cream with the Baileys and the cheesecake and all that. So if you want to layer, you know, go a little bit lighter on that. Squeeze bottle, or, you know, something like that. You can drizzle some sauces. You can heat up some jam. Make a little bit of a jam compote. Something like that. I hope that helps.
Awesome. And then another question.
Yep.
What is your thought about weighing ingredients versus the typical measuring cup method?
Very good question. So when I was in the restaurants, we always measured everything by weight, which is obviously, well, not obviously, it's definitely more accurate. However, I know that most home bakers don't have access to scales. So I've always taught as a home baker, as more than a pastry chef, because I know that it's not always easy for people to convert. As long as you're measuring correctly when you're measuring, it shouldn't matter. But there's less guessing of, let's say I need 3 cups of something and I get distracted, and then I can't remember if I've done 2 cups or 2.5 or 3, and then you might add more, or it's not leveled off. So if you kind of I would say if you pre-measure your ingredients ahead of time and you get yourself set up, you should be pretty accurate. But the scaling of the ingredients is also, you know, more accurate. But I would say it's less likely that people do that at home if they're not, you know, doing this all the time. Let me check on this real quick. All right. So these will puff up a little bit, like I said, so they look like cupcakes. And when you check it, you should be able to touch the top, and it should spring back on you, and it should feel set. If it's still really loose, it might need a couple more minutes. So I'm always in the mindset of a couple more minutes, not 5 more minutes, not 10 more minutes. But typically, if it looks really, really loose in the center of all of them, then I might do 5 minutes. But again, these will set up after they cool. They're going to deflate, and that doesn't mean you did something wrong. I've had a few people after this class say like, oh, mine flattened out. They didn't still have that dome on them. They're not going to, because it is not a cupcake. It's a little deceiving, but it does look like a cupcake. So you want to let those cool.
How young of a baker would you recommend for your cooking classes?
Let's see. I've taught kids as young as 6 or 7. That being said, a lot of parents sign up with their kids. I do charge per person, not per not per screen or per Zoom. So it depends on the child's comfort level. The only time I don't do the per person is for kids camps, where I do topics where the kids should hopefully be able to do a lot of it on their own. Doesn't mean, obviously, we have a pandemic going on and I can't be there to help them physically in the kitchen, and I don't want anyone to be injured. But the kids camps, usually the parents are kind of hanging out to help them with the oven, and then it's primarily the child on the screen the whole time. So I did teach 7 kids camps last summer. Those kids were ranging from 8 to 15-ish. But again, I've had some of those kids take regular classes with me every week. So it kind of depends on the child and your comfort level. If you feel like you're going to need to help them through the whole class, then yeah, you will each need a ticket. But if you feel like they could do it on their own and just kind of minimally help them here and there, then, I'm okay with that too. So I'd say my average young student is probably 10-ish, but I don't set a limit because I feel like that's up to the parent and the child to kind of decide. There are some topics I wouldn't necessarily recommend for certain children or certain ages, but I usually have parents ask me about those topics separately. So I'm always willing to chat with you about the child's level of comfort. Like macarons is not impossible. That usually does require a parent to be with them the whole time. So that would typically require 2 tickets if your child is, usually younger than 12. But, it's just a lot of techniques and kind of what they might need help with. So yeah, I don't limit the children's ages. But I've taught everybody from, I actually had an in-person parent bring a 3-year-old to a cheesecakes class. And then, I've had students every age level. So all of my classes, if you go on my Instagram and my Facebook at Annie's Signature Sweets, you'll see, people of every age in every class, which is fun for me too, because, I want everybody to be comfortable with what's going on and ask questions. So they're not as many people like there are tonight. So typically my classes range between 10 and 15 people, depending on the topic. So it's not too much going on. And if there's someone that needs extra help, I always stay on a little bit longer too. So hope that answered your question.
All right, that is all of the open questions we have. So do you have anything else you want to show us?
Well, my cheesecakes are not going to be set, but I do have some cupcakes that I can kind of show you how this ganache works.
How long do you want to typically let them set before you would do the ganache?
Yeah, you want them to set in the fridge for about 30 minutes to an hour before you put it on, just because it will melt immediately. So, but the ganache, like I said, is just an optional thing that you could do. But I can show you a little bit how to do this real quick. So if I were to, this is a key lime cupcake, but it's the same thing. So again, I have a scoop here, but you may not have access to that at home. And if I wanted to just coat it here, like you see, it's kind of spread. It's kind of like a Nutella consistency. So if you feel like you're going to use it in 30 minutes, you don't have to put it in the fridge right away because it will set up. This has only been sitting for about 15 minutes or so. And then you can spread it out with a little spatula or a butter knife if you don't have one. I kind of just go to the sides here. And then again, like I like to put like a fresh berry on there. You could take some ground up nuts if you guys like nuts, or you could put some sprinkles on here. You could put, let's see, I have some jimmies here. Like these kind of sprinkles would be fun. Let me take this raspberry off and just do that. You can kind of like dip it in the sprinkles here. kind of make that like a little fun. Again, this is a cupcake, but it works. It's going to be the exact same way you do your other one, your cheesecakes. And yeah, so they are best stored in the fridge if you're going to eat them in the next week to 10 days. If you are going to want to keep them longer than that, just pop them in your freezer. Again, just wait 15 minutes or so after they're out of the oven to put them in the fridge, and then maybe another 40-ish minutes for them to be set up if you're going to top them. And then if I were to top this and put it in the fridge, it would probably be done in 10, 15 minutes to be set. But again, it's edible. It's just going to be messy if I eat it right now. So the setup with the ganache on it won't be bad to eat while it's warm. It just will be really messy. So.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Anne. This has been great, and I hope that everyone goes home and tries to make these themselves and is successful, and that you also check out Annie's website so you can sign up for a cooking class with her. And yeah, thank you so much, Anne.
Thank you so much, Allison, and thank you everybody for joining me. I hope to see you guys soon. And if you guys have questions beyond the class, feel free to reach out. I'm always available. So thank you guys. Happy St. Patrick's Day.
Awesome.